some, because it doesn't take a lot, but it does really do a nice cleaning job. And you can stick that right in there and it's perfect. So I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. But it's really, it's not a hard thing to do. It's just time consuming at the very beginning. Then you leave it sleep, but you want to make sure that you don't put mulch on until after the last hard frost in the fall. Because rodents and those little critters, they're going to come in there and they're going to make a little nest in there and they're going to hide all winter long because they're going to be nice and cozy warm if you mulch or you put straw or anything down. So they're going to find a place to live, and you don't want them to do that. So after the last hard frost, that's time to do it because they're too cold. They're not going to wait that long, to find a nest for the winter. So they won't be in your garden. So does anybody have anything that they want to add? Or no? Well, that takes care of my session because there's not a whole lot to it, but it's a very easy something, and I do appreciate you asking me to be here.
Good evening. I'm Charlene Stapleton, Master Gardener, and I just introduced myself. I've see a lot of familiar faces, so I know you have heard me speak before. And as I was preparing for cover crops, and this is something that is kind of on the resurgent. It's what Sue was talking about and what I'm talking about. And I went through, because I always kind of go back over articles to see, have I talked about cover crops before? And there's three words, organic, green, and sustainable. You keep hearing these words over and over and over again. So there's sustainable landscapes. Landscapes take a look back to the future. Frederick Law Olmsted, who is one of my, if you're allowed to have idols as a gardener, he's one of my idols. He truly was the first to believe in sustainable landscapes. And if you go to Central Park, if you go to the Biltmore in Ashland, North Carolina, anything that's got his name on it is sustainable landscaping. He does that. He didn't plant flowers for tomorrow or next year. He planted for 30 or 40 years. What is this landscape going to look like in 30 or 40 years? What can I do to plant and save this landscape? So sustainable gardening, composting is sustainable gardening. Again, and these are all articles that were submitted to the newspapers on 2003, 2005. So I think I am into sustainable. I want things to stay. So tonight we're going to cover cover crops. Now, Sue actually kind of went into a little bit of the fundamentals behind the cover crop when she was telling you about the beets and beans. That's a cover crop. That's basically what a cover crop is. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit on what she said before I kind of get into this. It is considered a non-legume, leguminous type plant, and they're forage turnips, and then you've also got like an oilseed radish. So I'm just going to follow up on what she was talking about. They're very good, especially in our heavy clay soils, to plant things that just go down into the soil and open it up and just make it receptive. Also, these turnips and these radishes have the ability to pull nutrients to them. So, and they collect them and they hold them. So like when you till that up in the spring, all those nutrients are released. I just got a magazine today and I was reading it, looking at it right before I came here. How many of the pesticides do we know that are systemic? And we put it on our vegetables. How much do we know actually goes into that vegetable, and you can't wash it off. It's in there, and it's feeding. So there's just a lot of things that were good. I grew up with DDT. My brothers say that I was damaged, so I said that's a personal opinion, that's not fact. But anyway, so there's chemicals that, you know, they said there was harmless, you know, and now we find out that a lot of these things were not. So there's a resurgence of the green crops. A cover crop, the tops of the cover crop are the green manure. And then the bottoms of it, they're what I call the workhorse of the field. But even universities and researchers are coming up with information how to incorporate these cover crops into our lives. Cover crops perform a very important role in what we do. And mainly when I talk about or think about cover crops, there are several kinds. There's the annuals and the perennials. And I prefer annual because the perennial, you get into your wheats, your rye, you get into the perennial type crops for a small gardener or a small garden situation, say if you've got a 30 by 40 foot or if you've got raised beds, whatever your garden situation is, it's much easier to keep on top of an annual cover crop than it is to stay on top of a perennial. Number one, the perennials grow really fast. It's hard to suppress them or get them down. If you go in and you try to rototill them, if they're tall, you're going to get the tines all tangled up. The only thing you can do is cut those back, and then they've got this huge root system that you get your tiller tangled in also. So if that gets ahead of you, and you're a small gardener, if you think weeds are bad, get something that you really planted. Even annuals, buckwheat, like I said, that's my favorite. And well, it has to be probably 30 years ago that my mother and I started using it. We had an herb business, and we were trying to be sort of environmentally safe, and we decided to use buckwheat. And we have a real good organic farmer he still lives in Logan County. In fact, I contacted him when I was going to do this talk, and I tried to talk him into coming down, but he said maybe in the spring. So anyway, he told me about buckwheat. So my mother and I planted it. But the one thing that happens, especially if you run a business and you're trying to have a garden and you're trying to have herbs and everything else, you get busy. And they started to bloom, and buckwheat's quick. It'll come up, and in 30 to 40 days, you have got beautiful white blooms on the buckwheat. And we were out there, oh, you know, it's just beautiful, it's harmless. So we didn't get it down before it seeded. And for 5 years, I mean, we had still beautiful, lush gardens, but we could not control that buckwheat. You'd be out there and you'd say, oh no, here it comes again. You got buckwheat here. The seed's just like a weed. I mean, it's going to spread, it's going to go, and it's okay. This is buckwheat. I planted this, it was after September 15th, and I dug this up and put it back in a container. And these are a little bit, the ones out in the garden, I didn't go out after it rained today, but the ones in the garden, I went out this morning and looked at them. They're like this. I took those out of the garden 2 days ago. They haven't grown much since I brought them in, but out in the garden they're still growing. Now, one thing about cover crops, you can't just plant them and say, okay, just let them go. You have to water them. This may not go to blossom. Now, we've got these hot days again. It may just take off, and I may get a few blooms. But when they were talking, Sue was also talking about not putting anything on until you have the first hard freeze. Well, the nice thing about an annual is in the fall, just let it go. It'll kill. It'll winter kill. It's done. The winter kill will come in, and the thing that kills it is the frost. So leave that lay. Just leave it lay right there in your garden. You don't have to clean it up. Just leave it lay there. Everything's going to decompose by spring, and then you just go in and you till it, and you leave everything right there in the garden. But your legumes are clovers, hairy vetch, field peas, annual medic, and that's a new one. I hadn't heard that one really before. And I looked that one up. It's actually is an Asian annual, and it's very good. They're using it. Big farms are using it because there's about 35 species of it, but it's one of those things. You know, for a small farmer, they're not going to sell it in small quantities. This is something that if they're going to import it, they're going to get their money back. And us buying 2 or 3 pounds at a time is not going to do this unless you can get one of your farm co-ops or whatnot to work with you and do smaller packages with it. So anyway, you've got alfalfa and soybean. The non-legumes, your legumes have substantial amounts of nitrogen, ability to hold the nitrogen in the soil, 40 to 400 pounds per acre, depending on which legume you plant. So that's a lot of nutrients that are staying right there in the soil. Your non-leguminous plants, they don't hold and fix nitrogen as much, but they don't use so much from the crop that was the previous crop. I mean, they're down. They're not using. If there's any nitrogen or whatnot is left, they hold that and they gather it, but they don't make nitrogen. But they also gather the phosphorus and potash and that potassium. They also gather that, and then as soon as you till that, you release that. So those are rye, oats, wheat, the forage turnips, as she was said, and the oilseed radish, Sudan grass, and buckwheat. And like I said, buckwheat's my favorite. And this is what the buckwheat seed looks like. The soil quality improvements are unbelievable. The plants establish roots in the compacted area. They break up that hard soil, and it helps the erosion of the soil. Water filtration, it's especially if you put in something that is very deep rooted. You know, like I said, if the ground lays fallow, it just seals off. So, rotation. On that same page, you've got a chart. Now, this is mainly for big farms because they talk corn and soybeans. But if you look at the asterisks, you can see how all through the season, the little asterisks of when you can go in there with your cover crops and you can put those in. Big farms sometimes will not till at all. Now, we have that when you talk about the no-till farming. Sometimes when they go in, they will leave this in the rows so that they don't have the weeds, and then they don't have to go in with any kind of a herbicide to knock down the weeds. They just will cut it down. Sudan grass is it's a perennial, and I first was going to use that because you take on lots of hats at different jobs, and I was in charge of corn mazes. So I was going to try to do Sudan grass one year for the corn maze, let it grow 6 to 8 feet tall, and then cut through it, and you still would have a soft path. And then the next year, they could plant the corn in with it, and then when I cut the paths through it, I would have the Sudan grass and keep it down low. But that didn't work, but that's what farmers do. They go in and they cut it, or they have their cows go through it and forage. That's their grazing land, but they'll cut it back maybe 2 or 3 times a year. But that's how they manage it. They'll go through, and it's like a no-till. They'll keep what between it. They'll keep that mowed down, and then by the time it comes back, the crops are already growing. All right. Well, let's all go home and plan for next year.